I am pleased to welcome everyone to today's forum. Please just quickly some housekeeping. Please keep your mic muted and your video off. If you have any questions during the chat, please leave them in the forum Q&A section where we can get to them during our discussion part of the session. And if you would like to remain anonymous, that's fine. You can change your name by hovering over your name in the participant list. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Megan Cole, who, after 10 years experience working in the mining industry in South Africa and on climate change policy in Rwanda and other developing countries, she completed her PhD at Oxford and explored the big questions on how we understand, measure, and promote inclusive, sustainable development. She is now working with the Future Waters Initiative and still functions within the Minerals to Metals Initiative as well. So let me introduce you and hand over. Thank you so much.
You've got so much. Great. Okay, thank you everyone who's joined us today. As Aysha said, I'm at UCT doing research on the SDGs in mining, and I'm going to be talking about my research on measuring them in the mining host communities in South Africa. So as you all know, global SDGs were adopted in 2015 by 193 countries of the United Nations General Assembly, and they're an unprecedented global commitment to environmental protection, poverty reduction, equality, peace, and justice. They build upon the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015, and other existing international treaties, particularly the International Climate Change Agreements. There are 17 SDGs. They're very wide-ranging. They cover environmental, social, and economic challenges that we face. And there are 169 targets set to meet these SDGs by 2030. All the signatory countries have committed to defining, monitoring, and reporting on the national and subnational indicators and targets for the SDGs. Now, this infographic from Our World in Data is quite helpful in giving you a sense of the scope of the SDGs, because the 169 targets then have 232 indicators, and those are shown here in green, yellow, and red below the 17 SDGs. And what the coloring is showing how easy is it for us to actually measure and monitor these the SDGs through the indicators. Green indicators mean they're global official metrics. We have the data, and a lot of them were being measured in the MDGs. The yellow indicators they're not official metrics, and often the data is incomplete or outdated, while the red indicators are, to the best of their knowledge, not actually we can't actually monitor them yet. We don't have the data or the methodologies or the definitions. So while there's a huge number of indicators, we can't actually measure many of them now. There's ongoing work all over the world on getting there and doing this. In terms of reporting, there's obviously since 2016, when they came into force, the SDGs, there's lots of reporting happening. Quite a helpful overview comes from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And this slide just shows you the Africa report. They do them for all different continents and countries. And on the right is just the South Africa page within that report, showing overall performance, comparing it to the region, drilling down into the different SDGs, showing some trends, comparing with other indices. There's a huge amount happening in terms of measuring, reporting on the SDGs. In South Africa, we've been quite proactive and published an indicator baseline report in 2017, which was the list of the global indicators, but adding in South Africa specific indicators, and all the baseline data that was available at that time. And then last year, South Africa submitted its voluntary national review to the United Nations, giving an update on progress. So now, while national governments are responsible for the reporting of the SDGs, everyone knows and understands that they cannot be achieved purely by government. It needs to be a partnership with civil society, with multilaterals, and with the private sector. And so in terms of the private sector, which, is where mining fits, there are a number of guidelines and tools that have been developed by the United Nations Global Compact, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the Global Reporting Initiative. And the GRI is the standard used by the majority of corporates for their annual sustainability reporting. So this is already being done by many countries around the world, and the GRI have put out helpful guidelines on how you can link what you're already doing in terms of reporting to the SDGs. In mining in particular, a similar very helpful report was put out in 2016 called Mapping Mining to the SDGs, an atlas. And this sort of highlighted the major issue areas for mining, key opportunities to contribute to achieving the goals, case studies, and tools and resources. And in 2018, the University of Queensland's SMI, Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, published a report that reviewed 14 standards for sustainability that are used in the industry, in the mining industry, compared them to the SDGs, arguing that the SDGs is now the focal point for reporting, and we need to align all these very different initiatives together. And then on SDGs, and they also identify where the mining industry can support the SDGs. And as well, all the major mining companies are doing something on SDGs, mapping their business to the goals. This, all of this work can sort of be summarized at the high level as the mining industry can support the SDGs either by contributing overall to sustainable development. This is by producing the raw materials that are going to be needed for technological progress, economic growth, human development. Also paying royalties and taxes, which then support national governments and their efforts through employment, infrastructure, and corporate social investment. Then there's also the more direct local way that mining industry can support the SDGs, and that's by operating sustainably. And that is making sure to minimize negative impacts on society and the environment, on governance and human rights. Now that's a global perspective. In South Africa, mining companies not only do their voluntary sustainability reporting every year, but they also have to comply with regulations which require reporting, achieving targets, and actually contributing to sustainable development through how they operate. And this slide just shows you all the existing regulations and guidelines and acts in South Africa, and show how they already, mining companies are actually already required to contribute to the SDGs through all of this legislation. And I've just indicated which SDGs fit or map to the different pieces. So all the social and economic are covered in the mining charter, the social and labor plans, guideline and housing standard, or the environmental SDGs are addressed in the environmental management plans and the biodiversity guideline, and then health and safety are also addressed in the Mine Health and Safety Act Code of Practice. In terms of this talk, and interest was in the social and labor plans and how they require mining license applicants to develop and implement comprehensive plans for mine community development, and also housing and living conditions, the people who are living around the mines. So to my research, the question was really, what set of socio-economic SDG indicators can we measure in mining communities in South Africa? So instead of looking, most of the SDG and mining work is looking at companies and what's happening inside the companies, work on business strategy and that kind of thing. And I'm taking the community perspective and saying, how do we look at SDGs in the communities that host the mines? So what I did was I firstly identify and map all the large-scale mining host communities across indicators, as well as the South African domesticated indicators, and all the other relevant indicators used by the South African government, such as the South African Index of Multiple Deprivation, the development indicators, and the South African Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index. And then I selected a set of indicators that could be measured and collected the community level data, largely from the national census of 2011. I then visualized this in barometers of well-being and analyzed the data to look for potential factors that support sustainable development. Okay, so this slide shows the map of all 83 mining host communities that are identified in South Africa. So I started with looking at the major commodities and then where all the large-scale mines are that are operating, including any mine operating in the last 10 years, and found 73 different mining companies operating these mines. And then the host communities, just to clarify, what I mean by that is any town, village, or city that is adjacent, close to a mine and acts as its host community. And these communities are situated in 54 different local municipalities across the country, which is almost a quarter of all the local municipalities in South Africa. So it's very widespread. It's also in 2 of the metros, Tshwane and Ekurhuleni. And there are 5.4 million people. Well, in 2011, there were 5.4 million people living in these communities, which was 10% of the population. So as we all know, mining is very important in our country. Okay, this slide is just a snapshot from my Google Earth map version of what you've just seen. So I've just zoomed in to give you an idea of the work that I did to map these communities. And I took the boundaries for the main places and sub-places from the census. And the main places are towns or suburbs or townships or informal settlements, or they depending on the population, boundaries delineated to help with these census surveys. And I've color-coded them by commodity. So the turquoise is platinum, or PGMs and chrome. Purple is vanadium, white is diamonds, black is coal, and yellow is gold. So you see all the different mining communities and areas are basically around Gauteng. I've also shown the mines that are, a lot of the mines actually exist as sub-places within the census. And those boundaries are red, and all the local municipalities I've mapped here in green. And then I've also put in all the names, all the towns and cities for these areas. They obviously range in size. And then while I was building up this database of mining communities, I ended up doing a lot of reading about the history of mining and when these towns started and how they grew up. And so I developed a South African mining timeline of the major commodities, starting in the 1850s with copper up in the O'Keefe Copper District, and looked at copper, coal, diamonds, gold, PGMs, and iron ore. This summarizes the major commodities, but I obviously looked at it for all of the different commodities. And then what I also found was that there were very, very different kinds of communities that I was looking at. So quite a diversity, with population size being obviously a major factor. And I decided to plot population against 5 quantifiable parameters that make up sort of the level of influence of mining on the characteristic of the community. So I chose parameters that could be quantified, so duration of mining, proximity to the mine, remoteness, the number of mines, and then how long the town was established before mining started. And this showed 4 different types of communities emerge. They're the co-established cities, which are in blue there. There's 7 of them. It's cities like Welkom, Klerksdorp, Vereeniging, Rustenburg. And they grew up as from very small towns and have grown into cities alongside mining. And they have on average, mining has been happening there for 117 years. Then you get these large mining towns, and there are 9 of those, and they have a shorter duration, on average 74 years, but they're currently still right next to mine. Mining is on the doorstep. They're not that far from a city, and their population is between 60,000 and about 150,000 people. Then you get these small mining towns, many of which are very remote, even though they still have a very long duration, on average 80 years, but quite far away from the nearest city, and they generally have fewer mines. And then lastly, there's a more diverse group that I've called pre-existing communities, where there was an existing town or village that was there before mining started. And so they have quite different characteristics and range from rural villages to cities. Okay, this just looks at who's living where, and almost half of people living of the sort of 5.4 million people in mining communities, almost half are in co-established cities. Almost a third are in the pre-existing communities, and a much smaller amount in the small and large mining towns. Also broke it down by commodity, and it shows 44% of the people in these host communities are in coal mining areas, 24% in gold, 16% in PGMs and chrome, and 9% in diamond mining towns. Okay. And 13 SDGs, and pull out the ones that measure social and economic indicators. And so I've got 10 of those there, and then looked at the dimensions within that are the most relevant factors of well-being that you want to measure. And then I chose to use one indicator per dimension instead of doing a whole suite of indicators, as this is really a first study of testing the concept of measuring SDGs in mining communities. Now, it's also important to say indicators in the SDGs, social indicators, generally represent an acceptable social floor, which needs to be set for each country, because it will vary massively. Sort of a national poverty line is part of SDG 1, and that is going to be very different in Sweden to Sierra Leone. So South Africa has its own national poverty line, and that is its SDG indicator 1.2. But so it's because it's built on the MDGs, we're not looking at aspirational well-being here. We're looking at really what's the minimum standard of living that we want. So you'll see they're quite low, low levels of well-being we're talking about. So just to go through them quickly, to see what the indicators are. So SDG 1 is about no poverty, and that's the indicators for income is percentage of households with income more than 1,600 Rand a year, which roughly equates to the national poverty line in 2011 of about 800 Rand per person per month. And then I've added in the dimension household goods, even though it's currently not in the SDGs, because it's used in all the other poverty indicators in South Africa, indexes. And it's a good proxy for income, for when income isn't reported or it's underreported. So that's households that own a refrigerator. SDG 2 is no hunger. That is really about food security. Now, unfortunately, we don't have community level data across the whole country that I could use, so I haven't defined an indicator there. SDG 3 is health, which, as you would have seen at the beginning, there's a huge number of health indicators, none of which, or very few of which, are actually recorded in the census. They're collected in other ways. So I've used the one indicator, percentage of population without a disability, because that is in the census. SDG 4 is about education, and the indicator there is the percentage of adults who have a grade 12 or NTC 3 qualification. 5 is gender equality. Again, there's a range of different ways to look at gender equality. This isn't specifically in the census, and instead I looked at the non-financial census of municipalities to get a gender representation indicator. SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, is about access to water, piped water, and access to the toilet. Those are straightforward, but as you see, quite low levels of well-being. It's whether you have water in your dwelling or yard, or access to a toilet, which is not necessarily in your building. Okay, SDG 7, affordable clean energy. This is electricity access, which is straightforward. SDG 8 is decent work. So that indicators how many of the labor force are employed. SDGs 11 is sustainable cities and communities, which is largely about housing. So that's looking at how many people live in formal housing. And then finally, SDG 16 is about peace and justice. That's where safety fits in, which is obviously very important in South Africa. And unfortunately, we don't have community level data across the country for that either, so there's no indicator there yet. Okay, now don't worry, I'll quickly move on from another table. This just shows the summary of all the data for all those communities. And on the far right column, I turned that into a score out of 10, just to be able to compare communities and summarize all the data. And also, if you look in the second last row range, you'll see there's significant range across communities on all these different indicators, particularly for sanitation, but a lot of the others too. Okay, now this is, nobody really likes looking at tables. We all prefer pictures, so I've visualized all that data in what I call a barometer of well-being. And I'm going to show you quite a few of these, so I will just explain it a bit more, how to look at it. So the gray triangles are the current status, which is obviously for 2011, because that's the most recent data we have. So current status for each of those different indicators within the different SDGs. And that goes from the center is 0%, and the outer ring of the orange circle is 100%. So for income, you read that as 60% of people in these mining communities are above the national poverty line, but 40% of people are below the national poverty line. Yeah, the green is just showing the goal of having everybody. What we'd want is 100% for all of these indicators, that everyone lives above a minimum level of standard of living. Okay, but so this is it's an interesting plot. It looks similar to the national summary, but all the numbers are a bit higher. But what's more interesting is using it to compare different communities. So I'll move on. And this shows what came out on these 10 indicators as the highest and lowest levels of well-being across South Africa. So on the left is Aggeneys, which some of you will know, small town in the northern, mining town in the Northern Cape. And on the right is the rural villages of Modderspruit and Bapong in the northwest. And what you see is two very, very different standards of living in these two communities. This just gives a little bit of background on each to help understand the diagrams. So Aggeneys only has 2,272 people. It's this very remote town. The only reason it's there is because there's lead zinc mining happening. Modderspruit and Bapong, on the other hand, is a pre-existing community. They're rural villages between Brits and Marikana. And there's almost 60,000 people who are now surrounded by chrome and PGM mine. So the context is very important in understanding these diagrams, but it's a very stark contrast that we see. So then I thought, well, it would be great to look at to compare them by commodity, and would we see a big difference between, say, coal mining or diamond mining areas? And actually, there isn't much difference. There's diamond mining areas are slightly better off, and the PGM mining areas are the worst off, and that's largely because of the fairly recent mining on the eastern limb. The PGMs with lots of rural communities, which are now in mining areas. But not as much of a difference as I expected. And then I thought, well, let me look at the different types of communities that I identified earlier: the co-established cities, large mining towns, the small mining towns, and the pre-existing communities. And there was even less of a difference between those, which was even more surprising. And it doesn't seem to matter how big or small the town is. If you aggregate it up, you get very similar pictures. So then I thought, well, I haven't found any strong factors affecting well-being in these communities. Let me do some correlation analysis and see what else could come out if I looked at the parameters that went into classifying the community, such as duration of mining or how remote the community is. Maybe that would give some indication of what's determining well-being. And I got absolutely no correlation at all. So there's no link between population, duration of mining, remoteness, or how long the town had been there before mining on the well-being of that community. I then tried the actual indicators, the 10 SDG indicators I'd used, and got a correlation there. Not relatively strong social indicators, and the strongest two being water access and access to a toilet, which really shows it's about where someone lives. If they're in an informal settlement with limited access to a toilet, or a rural village, that's rather than, say, a wealthy suburb, that's the biggest factor, it seems, that affect your well-being. And that's really talks to the spatial inequality we have in South Africa and the legacy of apartheid that is we are still living with. So then one other thing I looked at, or I'm still sort of doing this, was saying how do these communities compare to the municipalities, both local and district municipalities, just to see is the mining having a beneficial impact on these communities. From very initial work, there is a high level of well-being compared to the local municipality, but as they have quite large rural areas often, that perhaps isn't very surprising. Comparing to the districts, there's quite a variation. Some are better off, some are worse off, but this is quite complex because of the can be other mining communities in that district, or there could be large towns and cities, or there could be rural areas. So it's hard to really pin down cause and effect. And then lastly, just comparing the overall results to national values, all the indicators come out higher for the mining communities. But again, that could be the urban-rural split, differences that we normally see. So just to give you some overall observations from this research on SDGs and mining. Firstly, that these indicators are useful measures of well-being of mining host communities, and they, I think, most usefully give a community perspective on mining, which is quite different to most of the SDG work that's giving a company perspective on how mining companies are working towards them. Secondly, what I found quite difficult was defining the actual host community boundaries. In cases where, say, there's a lot of scattered rural villages nearby these mines, or you have two adjacent urban centers and they've sort of merged into each other, and that's, it can be quite difficult deciding who is and who isn't the mining host community. And this is actually meant to be done in the social and labor plans, but generally it isn't defined, and often the data given in the SLPs is data for the local municipality, which is often a far bigger area than just the mine and its host community. So there's work to be done there. Then there's, as I showed you, significant range in well-being of different towns and villages. And I showed you the sort of town level data, but I also drilled down to the main place level, which is looking at suburbs and informal settlements and townships. And there's even greater variation or inequality there. And then, but this, when you aggregate it up by a commodity or community type, it kind of averages out and you lose that inequality. As I said, what seems to be the biggest determinant of well-being is the social spatial category. So do you live in an informal settlement or a suburb? And then also, I alluded to it, but indicator selection has a huge impact on your figures. You can choose, quite say, for water access, you can make your indicator piped water in your dwelling. You have to have water in your house, versus you can have, the indicator can be water access within 1 kilometer of your house. Those are both measures of water access, but they're very different measures. And that talks to an acceptable social floor. And are we being realistic about what is doable by the government by 2030? Or are we being idealistic and saying this is what people want and what will give dignity to our citizens? And then this is also, indicators are limited by available data at the local level, particularly. You saw with the SDGs globally, there's limited data and indicator methodologies for a lot of the SDG indicators, but that it's even more constrained when you come to the local level, because there's very little local level reporting on this kind of stuff. So it is actually quite difficult to measure SDG indicators for the mining industry with the current data we have. And I think it would be great if the mining companies would partner with the statistical agencies in South Africa, that's Stats SA, to regularly survey the mining communities. This would help mining communities support development in their communities, and it would help Stats SA to do better surveys and improve, fill in all the gaps they have in data. So final conclusions. Despite the vast mineral wealth we have and the long history of mining in South Africa, we're still sitting with millions of people in mining host communities living in deprivation. And that's quite there's a lot of complexity within that. You could look at people migrating into where mining is. And yeah, I don't want to get into all the details of that, but the fact is that there's still millions of people living in deprivation. There's also great variation in well-being across host communities. Significant data collection is required for mining to really measure and report the actual SDG indicators that are required. But a positive is that there's the existing policy and regulations in South Africa can quite easily be adapted to incorporate the SDGs, because the Act already sets up mining needs to be contributing to social and economic development of the country. But monitoring is essential for us to know how we do. And my very last slide, before I lose you all, is future research. What's still to be done? Where could we go? And obviously, I haven't talked today about the environmental SDG indicators, which is very important. I just, wasn't able to fit that in the scope of the work, but that would be really important work to do next, to look at the environmental elements. Secondly, it would be great to drill down into the different social spatial categories within the mining communities, and also look at the rural-urban migration that is happening. Thirdly, I didn't, in the SLPs in South Africa, mine communities actually include labor sending areas, which I didn't get to because that is another huge piece of work and requires information from the mining companies of where the employees come from. But so that's another piece of work that needs to be done. And then lastly, Jenny Broadhurst and I are talking of adapting the classification that I've developed here into a mine closure risk classification. There are many mines facing closure, and that's obviously going to have a huge impact on the people living in these communities. So with that, I will stop. Thank you for your time and let you all have a turn to talk.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was really fascinating. I know, at least from the legal perspective, defining what a community is incredibly challenging, and I'm really interested in how you've done this. But without further ado, we've got loads of questions for you, so I hope you're excited. So the first question is, did you focus on purely the mining areas of mines or their associated processing plants, which are maybe geographically distanced and often legislated under other legislations, hence not requiring SLPs? These sites would fall under the metals part of mining to metals spectrum. For example, smelters associated with mines, which in some instances smelt ore for a number of mines. Those smelters would not exist without mining and therefore present additional opportunities to contribute to the SDGs, even though they're outside the SLP framework. Shall I read the first part again?
And no, I just looked at them.
Okay.
I've got it here. I've got it in front of me. Yeah, I only looked at the mining areas. I didn't do processing plants as well, which, yes, definitely are often often they're in the same community, but often, yeah, that would be another, but I'll add that to the future research list. Yeah.
Okay, the next question. What indicators would you select to measure the impact of partnerships as per the SDG 17?
Yeah, so I didn't look at SDG 17 because to me, this just doing this, having the mining industry looking at these kind of indicators, which some would argue are, the responsibility of government and not of the private sector. It is essentially, we're looking at a partnership here of the mining industry needs to partner with the government for the benefit of these communities. I mean, I think probably like in South Africa, it's if we're achieving the goals of the social and the mining, that is achieving SDG 17. So perhaps it's something about the successful implementation of the mining legislation.
You have a question around the realities and how are we actually going to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which is.
I don't think anyone thinks we'll achieve them by 2030. But what we saw with the Millennium Development Goals is just having the goals changed things significantly. It meant there was a lot of donor funding going into achieving these goals. It shifted politicians' focus areas. It created technology transfer from the global north to the global south. There were a lot of things that came out of having those Millennium Development Goals that were all very good. And we didn't meet the MDGs, but there was significant progress towards them just by them being in place. And I think that's what everyone sees on the SDGs, is we need to set an ambition. We need to set these goals so that we're working towards them. I've actually reading about SDGs beyond 2030 and looking out to 2050. The people are already thinking of post 2030 what we're going to do. So it's
always having that continuous forward-thinking vision is necessary, so we kind of point our noses in the right direction at least. There's another question, whether your study included labor sending areas that not necessarily in South Africa.
tricky to get information on because it needs to come from the mining companies in terms of where their employees are from. And so all the publicly available social and labor plans have that. So I have some of that information, but a lot of them, there's 175 mines that I looked at and over 70 companies, and a lot of those are not available, and we just don't have that data. So it's a much bigger piece of work. And it's also incredibly diverse. There's people from across Southern Africa coming in to work on our mines, and so it's not just South Africa we then would be looking at, we'd also be looking at Southern Africa. So it's a much bigger piece of work.
Another question from Teresa. I wonder what the data would look like if you assessed access to reliable and quality medical services as your health indicator. For example, Agnes has a small clinic, but people have to travel far for advanced healthcare. I'm not sure what Batong, I'm not pronouncing that right, Bapong had, but would likely be the same or worse off for the community as a whole. Just a different perspective on measuring health.
I think I've lost you.
Oh no. Oops. If you're struggling to see or hear me, maybe if you wouldn't mind just touching on the question and just reading it out and answering it briefly, or now I can't see you.
Sorry, Aysha, I can't hear you at all. I'll answer the questions in the Q&A.
I can still hear you.
Sorry, I can't hear Aysha at all.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm gonna try.
Okay, I'm just going to read the questions myself and answer because I can't hear anybody. This is a real Zoom vacuum. Okay, so from Teresa, what the data would look like if you assessed access to reliable and quality medical services as the health indicator. Yes, health, the disability indicator isn't a very good one because there isn't much variation, and healthcare would be better. Yeah, so I agree with that. It's just hard to actually measure that. You don't get that in the census. So we would need the local, like I say, local level data is very hard to come by. So we'd have to look at every single mine community and gather the data for each community. Okay, then a question from Abel Sakar. 2 questions. Did you look at communities only linked to the nearby mine? Or did you also take into account the impact that may result members of the community working at a mine in another area? Yes, I only looked at communities linked to the mine. I didn't have employment data. I would love to get that, but that is a huge piece of work, getting the employee data from every single company. Probably what I need to do next is case study. Second question, did you also look at the multiplier effect of mining in the local economy? While mine may not directly respond to SDGs in communities, but through associated businesses, the overall performance is different. Yes, again, similar to employment, yeah, it would be very good to look at multiplier effects and the economy as a whole, but just didn't have the time or data to do that. Like I said, there's lots of interesting future research questions out there.
Are you able to hear me?
A question from Jeremy Mann. The legacy of mining is the deterioration of living conditions in the community post-mining closure. Sustainable development is about the continued and sustainable well-being of communities. Have you considered doing this exercise for the communities in the areas where mining operations have closed? Yes, I did in the, looking back at the history of mining in South Africa. I've also identified all the communities, all the mines that were closed. Say the copper district in the Northern Cape, a lot of mines closed there, or obviously the whole Joburg area, the Rand, a lot of mines closed there. So yes, definitely I could do that. What I actually really wanted to do, but just didn't have the time for, was to look at the last 3 censuses for each of these communities. So the 2011 census, the 2001 census, and then the 1996 census, and then actually track the change in well-being over time. I think that would have been really nice. But yes, it's another, I'll add it to my long list of what to do next. Okay, question from Harold. Are you using the national levels of indicators as your putative control group against which your mining communities are compared? No, as I said, I just started doing that I started comparing to the rest of the country. That's sort of only started that last week, really. And I feel like comparing to the whole country isn't that useful because of the, significant rural areas we have. Just to compare towns and cities against, largely towns and cities against rural areas isn't that helpful. And which is why I'd spend most of my time looking at the differences. There's a huge range between these mining communities. So that's what I focused on. Okay, next question. Malusi Butulezi. Quite keen on the addition of environmental SDGs, especially related to climate change within coal business. Yes, I am too. Hopefully I'll get to that next.
Hi, Megan, can you hear me?
Anonymous. How did you come up with the SDGs? As if not all 17 SDGs, and would you recommend mines prioritize those as part of their strategies? Yes, it's not 17 because I didn't look at, for this study, I didn't look at the environmental SDGs. That is, most of the rest are actually on the environmental side. It's quite a different approach to take when you're looking at measuring environmental indicators rather than social indicators. So yeah, I didn't get to those, but that it would be good to complete all 17 SDGs. And then would I recommend mines prioritize those? I would say the indicators within the SDGs. So I would say to mining companies, don't try and do 232 indicators. You'll never get there, and no one in the world is measuring that many because a lot can't be measured right now. But so what I tried to do was to have a manageable set of indicators. It's only 10, and they represent what each of those SDGs is really trying to do. So yes, it is as a first step. I think it would be great if mining companies engaged with this set of indicators.
Megan?
Freedom on Esric. Could it be that wherever there are more jobs, better education, better services, they attract more people and are absorbed? Yes, I think that's definitely a factor. And that's, I said at the end, it would be great to look at inward migration into the city and actually track it over time, because when a mine opens up, it attracts a lot of people, and that you often get informal settlements developing, which are the least well-off areas in the country. So yeah, it's not a straightforward. Communities are complicated things, and we can't just say the mining, because there's low levels of well-being, it's the mining company's fault. It's, if people have migrated, it's more complicated than that. Okay, Tandazile, stemming from the Atlas, so that's the mapping the SDGs, mapping mining to the SDGs Atlas, which acknowledges not factoring artisanal and small-scale mining in their mapping. Are there considerations to do the same for the ASM sector, looking at how ASM contributes to the SDGs? Yeah, look, I just looked at large-scale mining for this study, again, to just keep the scope manageable. I think there needs to be a different approach with the ASM sector. And we should probably have a chat offline about that, because yeah, lots of work to be done there. Okay, we're running out of time. I see Aysha's just sending me a message. So I'll just answer a few more questions and then I'll hand back to Aysha. I don't know what happened between you and I. Very strange. Anyway, Louis, is it possible to consider the SDGs as determining factors for preparing the environmental impact study? Yeah, I mean, the SDGs really cover all aspects of communities and the environment and governance, and were definitely helpful to review before you consider starting a mine and doing an environmental impact study. Okay. Then it's an anonymous. No, sorry, I've skipped that one. What's happened? Lorata, climate change action. SDG 13 is gaining momentum as one of the critical SDGs mining companies should be addressing due to its, oh goodness, due to its interlinkages. Are you going to focus on this in the future? Yeah, climate change, there was some debate in developing the SDGs on whether to include climate action because of the, huge amount of work being done with the COPs and the international agreements. So, there's debate whether you should actually focus on climate change in the SDG context. Definitely, I think for mining, there needs to be a separate sort of strategy on climate change. And it is incredibly important, obviously, because the climate change is going to impact the poorest and the most vulnerable the most. So I don't have a plan to focus on it, but it definitely is very important for the industry. Okay, I think I'll do one more question and then hand back to Aysha. Ishmael Mazinda, this study emphasizes the need for a community-specific response and strategy from the mining companies with regards to SDGs. And as such, companies should survey host communities prior to developing the strategies. Comment. Yes, I agree. I think there should be a lot more work being done by mining companies on understanding their communities. And that is sort of implicit in this SLP, but you don't really see it being done. I think there needs to be, the actual areas named, the data gathered where possible. If there isn't data, it should be, surveys should be done. It's not a complicated thing, and it's not hugely expensive. And I really think there needs to be a much better understanding of the host communities from the mining companies. I think a great example of SDG 17 is the mining companies partnering with the statistical agencies to actually gather the data that's needed to understand the community and then monitor development in those communities. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Megan. If you can hear me, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened there. I think it must just be between the two of us because everyone seems to be able to hear me. Sorry about that. And thank you so much for carrying on and reading through all the questions. I really appreciate it. I probably can't hear me, but my appreciation is there. We've got one hand up. I'm not sure if Harold would like to address the panel quickly, and maybe we can then see if Megan can hear you. Otherwise, I think I'm going to close the session. Harold, would you like to still address us?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know if Megan can hear you.
Megan, can you hear me? Megan?
I don't think she can hear you.
Let me pose the follow-up question. Nevertheless, implicit in these sustainable development goals for mining, it appears to me that somehow or other the mines as corporate entities or corporate citizens are going to be expected to do certain things for development of communities. Now, if from Megan's study, and that's why I was asking a reference group, the communities surrounding the mines are already better than the national average. In other words, the communities are better off in over the range of measurements than the surrounding communities. Are we expecting the mines to do even more? In other words, that the mines set themselves up as mini governments doing social development, infrastructure development, over and above the taxes which they contribute to the body politic of the country. It seems to me that somehow there's a fundamental underlying question, or conceptual perception in the Sustainable Development Goals that is treating the mines as in a different way from other corporate entities and paying taxes once to the government.
So the question is,
Sorry,
are we expecting mining companies to do even more than they already do? So, I mean, what I was saying there was, I think they need to be understanding the communities through surveys, which is that if you're partnering with this stats agency, Stats SA has the people and the skills to do it. They just don't have the resources. They are a cash-strapped organization, and even the next year is going to be the 2021 census, and it's at risk at the moment, particularly given COVID-19 and the economic implications. We're not sure we're going to get a good census next year, and we cannot, we cannot measure. We cannot manage what we cannot measure. We need to know what's happening in our communities. And so the census is essential. But I think it would be fantastic if mining companies could support this kind of survey work, of community survey work that can be done by Stats SA, but do it through financial support, and potentially that could be done as part of social and labor plans. Or corporate social investment. I think it's a much bigger discussion on who is responsible for the well-being of mining communities, and how do it's a partnership of government and mining. But it's, I think, a much bigger discussion.
Thanks, Megan. Sorry if it appears there's an overlap, and we're just gonna have to maybe end the session now. But thank you so much to Megan. Thank you for all of the questions from the panelists, from the attendees. Apologies, and the research will the.
Sorry, I still can't hear.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna end the session. Thank you so much to everyone who attended, and I look forward to seeing you all next week for our next installment of the Minerals to Metals online forum. Thank you so much.